Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. Literature is a reflection of us. And while we seek narratives to understand the world around us, these works and words play just as an important role in shaping how we think about the future and how we think about our identities. On today's show, we talk about the power of literature, especially in the age of fast information. Joining us for this conversation is Dr. Osama Siddique, who's a Pakistani scholar, academic, and author of Pakistan's experience with formal law and Snuffing Out the Moon. He joins us from Lahore. Also joining us today is Mr. Elnathan John, who's a Nigerian lawyer and author of 3 books, including Becoming Nigerian, a Guide. He joins us from Berlin. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Dr. Osama Siddique, let me begin with you. Starting off from that point of the fact that we are living in an age of fast information. We get an influx of information, get an influx of opinions, especially talking about social media. Do you feel like the way we engage with literature is changing?
Very much so. And I think the problem with that lies in the words, the very words that you used, influx and fast, So when you have something fast, and it's hitting you all the time, you get very little time to actually absorb anything. And in any event, whatever goes around on social media still requires content. Social media is great in terms of being a new, faster, more efficient mode of communication, but there is still no substitute for the underlying text. So I think, unfortunately, what's happening is that when people get completely enamored by social media and just getting their information there, and they get out of the habit of reading longer texts, analyzing those texts, looking at the nuances, looking at the interpretations, their sense of the information they get is very superficial. It also lacks perspective. So I think it's an uphill struggle, but I think it goes without saying that there is still a lot of value to reading conventionally, to reading literature in particular, which is, of course, a subset of reading in general. And I don't think we can get away from social media. I think it is very useful, but we need to ensure that we somehow strike a balance between the two.
Right. Dr. Siddique mentioned here the information that readers get lacks perspective. What do you exactly mean by that?
In particular about literature as such, and give you some examples. Literature has so many advantages, but to me, some of the most important advantages is that it gives you perspective and it creates empathy. And it does so because the form, the nature of the genre is such that it takes you to a different life experience. It causes you to sort of steep yourself in that experience. Some of the greatest novels written in human history actually provide us a sense of that time, that period. Now, we as humans and as societies, when we confront new challenges, the fact that we've actually looked deeply and looked emotionally into other times and other places and other people's experiences actually equips us much better to deal with these situations, to deal with these challenges. And tolerance also, because, it's very easy to subscribe to a particular set of view that you are comfortable with. On the other hand, if you've read widely and if you've steeped in the cultures of other countries through literature, chances are that you will grow in tolerance. Right. So I think it's the deeper reading of human psychology, of the human experience, which literature is fantastically equipped to communicate.
Right. Dr. Siddique, I want to talk more about building that empathy through literature when you read and engage with texts that belong from other cultures, written by other people, what impact that has on the human experience. But before that, I want to jump to Mr. John and talk to him about this very idea of an influx of information. Now, we talked about it from the reader's perspective. How do you as a writer feel like it impacts you in your writing, and especially when you are talking about your personal experiences as a writer and trying to jot them down?
Well, I do think that one of the things that social media does is that it acts as a bridge between hitherto cut-off audiences, so people that were discriminated against by, for example, mainstream publishing and mainstream media. As a writer, it also opens new audiences to me. So in many respects, I like to see a lot of this from the point of an advantage, and that in fact, for example, it would have been very much harder for me to engage with readers in Lahore, for example, far away from Nigeria.
Right.
And so in that sense, I think that there is a lot of positive. But as Dr. Siddique said, for me, it's even as a writer, it's about balance. And a lot of what serves as an advantage can, in fact, become a hindrance to deeper thought, to nuance, to all of the depth that slow reading and slow writing actually brings to literature. And it is this kind of thought that gives me pause when I think of things like social media and my engagement with it as a writer.
Right. Now, both the things that you and Dr. Siddique mentioned were trying to engage with people, and the empathy and the sensitivity, and the fact that people, and especially you mentioned this, Mr. John, the fact that people who were disadvantaged from publications, from putting out their material, now have that medium. This really brings me to the question, which of course in our part of the world definitely holds true, and I want to get your take on it as well. How do you think literature and writing has changed in the post-colonial state, especially when the mind is trying to decolonize itself and it's trying to build empathy with other cultures, but also recognizing its own identity and culture?
One of the things that decolonization forces us to do is to confront power structures. And in fact, some of these power structures exist within literature itself. And so, which is why, for example, for me, the social media and all of these new ways of putting out information are a very powerful advantage in sidestepping these power structures that have reinforced colonial narratives time and time again in key texts that a lot of us were made to read in high school and even in university. I trained first as a lawyer, and one of the first things I was happy about was that my university introduced this sort of decolonizing course in history, where everything that we learned about history in school was dismantled. And we only know this because there were people who forced themselves into this very patriarchal space, broke the bonds of even academia that held them to these narratives. And so as a writer, I'm thankful for these kind of opportunities to question structures of power that have held in strongly entrenched ways narratives that keep people in perpetual bondage, both mentally and even by way of narratives.
Right. Dr. Siddique, I'm curious to know, you as a writer, does any part of what Mr. John's experience was, does that resonate with you?
Resonates very strongly. I think the experience of a lot of post-colonial nations have been very similar. When I read Nigerian authors, for instance, when I read Chigambamba Adichie and others, it's very clear how much similar the kinds of books which we were given to read, the school system, the stereotypes, the aping of the West. But I want to connect that to what was just said, and I want to underscore that because I'm completely in agreement. As a medium, social media, I think, provides a tremendous opportunity. It is indeed empowering, and it also strikes against conventional elitist structures of dissemination. Absolutely no cavil with that point. But at the same time, I think the question you asked about how literature is changing, I think literature is changing tremendously. Having said that, so I mentioned some writers, and there are others who are actually breaking new ground, who are questioning conventional colonial notions and post-colonial notions of power, hierarchy, patriarchy, all that. But I think it's also very important to keep in mind the fact that while social media has indeed been empowering, and I agree with our other analysts today that the publishing industry is incredibly elitist still. There are some sort of exceptions to the rule, but by and large, you will not find any major publishers in developing countries themselves. They don't have the distribution networks. A lot depends on what a white editor or publisher in the global north, in the West, thinks about a work. And I think that also has an impact on the writing which is produced, at least on part of some people, because there is this pressure to make this work more intelligible, more palatable for a Western audience, which could detract people actually from writing what they really want to write.
Right.
Still, there are exceptions, and there are people who are writing very bravely, and they're writing what they think is the truth they want to disseminate.
Right. Dr. Siddique, I'm curious to know that point that you put there, that many writers feel the pressure to mold their writing, mold their literature in a way that it becomes more easily digestible, especially for the Western audiences. Is that still the ultimate goal for many of the writers today, especially those who are writing from post-colonial contexts, post-colonial societies, which is to cater to the Western audience?
So, you see, there's a very practical financial reason for that. If you want to make a living off your writing, it's an incredibly difficult thing to do. First of all, to break through. Secondly, to find a market, then to actually sell enough books. And it's not a very even playing field. It's a very incestuous, cloistered kind of a world. Who do you know? Not to say that some very good books don't get picked up, or all editors and publishers are like that. But yes, there is a tremendous pressure if you actually want to make a living, because unfortunately, for example, even if you look at Pakistan, look at the size of the country and how many people, how many writers can actually be full-time writers? Can they sell enough books? Part of the problem is whether there's a readership, but there's also a problem, there are not enough indigenous publishers. A lot of the people writing in English, especially fiction, have been publishing in India. And even now that is not a possibility because there's an embargo on the import of stuff between the two countries. So there are very practical issues why writers may be forced to do that. Some of it, I think, also has to do with the very legitimate desire to have a global audience. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think there are also continuing remnants and impacts of this colonial mindset that we don't think somebody is really good unless there is a stamp which actually comes from the West. There's this legitimacy. So that's a problem. But people are sort of fighting against it.
Right. Mr. John, do you feel like this entire dynamic that Dr. Siddique talked to us about, the link between publishers and the authors, it just continuously reproduces that power dynamic that you mentioned earlier exists within literature itself? And do you feel like in the near future we might come to the point where we can break free from that?
Indeed, I agree with Dr. Siddique in when he analyzes these power structures and how they reproduce these old narratives. There is like Dr. Siddique said, again, the legitimate desire for writers to have an audience. If as a writer I don't have an audience, what am I writing for?
Right.
So, in fact, one of the biggest things that can happen is that we have more independent presses. That's one. Two, that we have more translation between countries so that people who are writing and publishing in small spaces in languages other than English can enter slowly perhaps into the mainstream audience, because one of the sort of ways that books can smuggle themselves into mainstream consciousness is through translation. And so, for example, if you were writing in a local language that doesn't have the advantage of huge presses, if a press in a country very far away picks it up, it bypasses this thing that editors do, where they try to force it to become intelligible to audiences in the UK and all of that. If I'm buying a book from Pakistan, I'm not going to rewrite it. I'm going to translate it. And so translation is one great way of bypassing this. Third, I think that we can encourage these hybrid spaces where they're not actually in traditional publishing, but also they're not let loose on social media without any sort of control. And so, for example, funding things that make editors, for example, grow in these countries. If we're able to support editors, support small publishers, independent presses, and support translation, I think that this is one way of making sure that we are able to sort of, in some little way, bypass this huge block, which is the reproduction of stereotypes and old narrative.
Right. Mr. John, I hear you talking about translation and what a powerful role it can play in order to make a text more international or allow it to seep into other places, into other cultures. Now, one of the primary discussions, especially from a literary point of view, is what is lost in translation? What do you think we lose at the cost of doing this, if anything?
I would say rather that we gain in ways that are innumerable. Translation is its own skill. It's a completely different thing. Translation does not represent itself as being an exact science. What translation does is that it brings into a new world that which exists in another. And so the process of moving text from one world to the other certainly will give it a different form. This does not mean that things are lost. I would rather say that things are gained, right. And that in fact every culture seeks to engage with others, to build it, to grow it, and that it will not always take the same form or shape. And this shape shifting that translation does should be seen, in my view, as a positive thing. Of course, poor translations make us lose things, and that's really the problem. Every skilled translator only enriches the text, only opens new vistas through which we can see these worlds that the translation exposes to us.
Right. Right. Thank you so much, Elnathan, John, for such a fascinating conversation, for joining us and taking out the time to talk to us about this. Dr. Siddique, now, as we're talking about how different texts are taken in different regions and how we can allow them to get to different regions, now, one thing is about the fact that who reads who and how they critically engage with the text. Do you feel like critical engagement is also declining, especially when we see echo chambers being created, when we see people falling for the cult of a personality as opposed to the text and the content?
So I think that's a very good question. I just want to say that all that Elnathan said about alternative spaces and about translation, I fully concur with him. I think he put it really, really well. Now, let us also look at a couple of other things which inhibit this critical engagement which you talk about. Let us not forget that at least for those of us who write in English, we are automatically alienating a very large portion of our own population who are not comfortable reading in English. So I think there's a huge responsibility we also have to be able to disseminate that work to most people. So I'm actually really very excited because one of my summer projects is that the Urdu translation of my novel is going to be out in a couple of months, and I'm very closely involved in the translation with a translator, I think, who's brilliant. And what you said about what's lost in translation, I agree with Elnathan, that if it's a skilled translator, it's almost like recreating a work of art, and it takes on a life of its own. Now, coming to critical engagement, language, as I said, is the inhibition. 20, 30 years ago, much of world literature, especially Russian and Chinese literature, used to be translated into Urdu, and it used to be accessible. But there was, I think, more critical engagement because our universities and colleges were more vibrant spaces. I think they're still not doing badly, but I think they have the primary responsibility to be the places where books and ideas are discussed, writers are engaged with. I think your television media is also somewhat neglecting this entire area. How many programs can you point out where actually books and literature are discussed? What you're doing is a rarity and a very welcome addition to that very small list. So I think we used to have a lot of center points of discussion, circles of literature. I think literary festivals have partially helped in recreating that. Right. The fact that books are available now more widely, that's also a positive thing. And social media definitely helps in terms of getting the word out. But I think for a country of our size and our diversity and our potential, there isn't enough discussion about books. And a lot of voices do get marginalized. You're absolutely right. Cult figures, people who can speak English, people who have access to the West, take too much eminence in this entire discourse.
Right.
And regional languages suffer.
Right. Dr. Siddique, on that point, just stay with me. I want to also introduce Ms. Jamie Stiehm, who's an American journalist, columnist, who writes about national politics and history. She joins us from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, Ms. Stiehm, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, we've been talking about critical engagement and how that has varied given the political and cultural context that many of our societies exist in. Now, almost a global phenomenon in which we see echo chambers existing, largely contributed to the reproduction of the same opinion because of social media and et cetera, et cetera. Now, how do you take that? Do you feel like critical engagement is on the decline?
I think when we say social media, we should question how social it really is. Literature, novels, discussion of serious ideas seem to be so they're fast and easy and very immediate gratification, but the work that is involved in reading a novel seems to be losing out in the cultural conversation.
Right. Now, Ms. Stiehm, just moving back a little and talking about the earlier conversation I was having with our panelists here, it was about how cultural from different regions is perceived by the West, how it's taken by the West. Now, you, of course, talking to us from the United States, and you focus a lot on history. How are different versions of history, different narratives of history, which were for so long marginalized, but now that become more openly discussed, how do you think that the community in the West takes those, perceives those?
Do you mean right here and now in the pandemic and the crisis that we're facing, or do you mean sort of in
generally?
Because I think in generally, I think we're more open to different narratives, and literature gives us a chance to travel across time and distance, without leaving our living room. But it is something that is more, it has to be done one-on-one with the writer. It's not quote-unquote social. And I think we're sort of used to having immediate responses or clicks or likes. And that is a very different ball game, very different skills or different interests. And reading is taking, for example, in colleges and universities in the United States, English is less popular as a major. History is less popular as a major than engineering or neuroscience. So right now there's a real balance of power between the humanities and, say, engineering and online mediums.
Right. Dr. Siddique, going back to this point, you mentioned about the marginalized voices, how important it is to bring that in. Now, this is a question that I asked Ms. Stiehm. How is that perceived in the Western world when you have challenging narratives? But just talking about those narratives being able to be talked about, being able to be recorded. We know that archives don't exist for many of those voices. Is there a way we can begin, especially from oral histories and different type of folktales, which especially exist in our region, for those to be extracted and then promoted in the form of written literature?
So I guess one more patronizing approach is that we talk about our mainstream universities and cultural centers and national institutes for languages and literature to go out and sort of archive it and to highlight it. And I'm not saying that's necessarily all wrong. It can play a good part. One refreshing thing is that I noticed that in our literature departments in a lot of public sector universities and private universities, the curricula have really changed. And so it's no longer 18th century English literature or even earlier English literature. They are teaching 20th, 21st century literature and a lot of literature from the global south. So that's a good thing. But I really think that the way to make a difference would be to actually focus on the universities in those very areas which are the most backward. How do you create more capacity there? How do you create more opportunities for students over there, local poets, writers, scholars, not just in terms of patronage, but in terms of genuine opportunity to study more, to engage more, to publish more? And that's where I think the literary festivals can also play a role, as should the media, because I think more space needs to be created. Now, a lot of these local voices have very loyal followings and very nuanced followings. There are people who live in small towns, familiar with the local poetry, local lore, but also familiar with global literature.
Right.
I have been pleasantly surprised as I've traveled to see how much potential there is.
Right. Ms. Stiehm, last question to you. Now, talking about creating those genuine spaces for voices that aren't as frequently heard, from cultures that aren't seen as much, do you feel like that there is a move in universities, especially some of the Ivy, some of the highest rated universities in the United States, doing that, pushing those boundaries?
Yes, I think that's correct, that the syllabi has changed, and there's more awareness and more attention to teaching those marginalized voices or narratives that have never been more important as the world gets smaller and smaller. It's just that there's not as much of an audience. The students who are majoring in literature are, there's fewer and fewer of them. I think there's less cultural emphasis on being culturally conversant with literature that comes from all over, and not only Jane Austen and Virginia Woolf, who happen to be my favorites, but knowing like the global sort of span and spectrum that would make us all, I think, more fulfilled and more engaged and more empathetic to, others. Americans are particularly needy in that department.
Right. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave this conversation at that. Such an interesting conversation, but since we've run out of time for this segment, we have to go for a break. Thank you so much, Dr. Osama Siddique, for joining us from Lahore, Ms. Jamie Stiehm for joining us from Washington, D.C. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we're going to continue with our conversation. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. Now, how does reading and literature impact the mind at a deeper level? Let's discuss this further. Joining us for this discussion is Dr. Finza Latif, who's a child and adult psychiatrist at Sidra Medicine at Qatar, and she joins us from Qatar. Also joining us today is Dr. Ghazala Hayat, who's a board-certified neurologist teaching at St. Louis University. She joins us from Virginia. Thank you both for joining us, and welcome to the show. Dr. Ghazala Hayat, let me begin with you. Now, one of the main things we took away from the previous segment was the fact that literature helps us develop a sense of empathy. How do you think that, given your field and given your expertise, is true, and how does that really work?
So that is actually very true. We cannot say the brain is separate from what we call our emotions and everything. There's an area in the brain which we call hippocampus, where we have memory and we have empathy and our emotions. So it has been shown that with reading, which is like more when we read it and we're looking at other images and everything, that it connects to that area. And good literature and reading from very early age with a functional MRI scan, they have shown those area gets the more connection. And that's where it develops with empathy. At the emotional level, if you want to think about it, it's like that. When I'm reading, a child is reading, or an adult is reading, we practically at the brain level, we start feeling that we are going through that. We connect with that person, and then we start developing empathy. And they have shown bigger connections from that hippocampus to also cerebral cortex, where is the area where we, think and everything else.
Right.
So creating empathy is very true.
Right. Dr. Ghazala Hayat, I'm to know, do you feel like this creation of empathy and the impact that reading and literature has on the mind is different for someone in the developmental stages and someone who's an adult?
That's very true. Because it also depends where and what level we are developed, A 4-year-old, when he's going to look at it, there's, a child is crying or looks at an animal picture, they will develop at a very concrete level. Once we grow up, we have more abstract thinking process, so our empathy will be different also at that time when we are adults, we already made a lot of connections, we already have our thought processes. We have like a frame of reference, how we feel about anything. Most of the time, I'm going to, it's like what we call it, we listen to things we like or we agree. So that my empathy or my level of that might be a little bit different.
Right. Dr. Finza Latif, now when we talk about children and reading, something that we hear a lot these days is there's not enough of that being done. And often what we hear in response to that is the fact that we just don't have the attention spans that we once did. Do you feel like you witness that in a lot of patients that come to you, with a lot of children you deal with, that attention spans are now shrinking?
So it's not that our attention span is shrinking. It's more that currently we live in this age of information overload. We collectively as humans have a concrete attention span, but now as compared to 10 years ago, we have a lot more information that's vying for our attention. So, 10 years ago, if you were reading a book, you were less likely to be distracted by a message on your phone, or, for example, with TV, there were fewer shows on TV. Now you're able to get your news from various different media. So it's just that there are many more things that are there to distract us. And so it's harder to sustain attention for children on one thing at a time.
Right. Even when we're talking about adults, Dr. Finza Latif, it seems like a wandering mind. And as you stated, the various distractions that exist exhaust a person mentally. Is there a way, are there exercises in which the mind can be retrained or trained in order to focus at a given task, especially when we're talking about reading literature?
Absolutely. There's now a growing body of evidence that there are ways that we can use practical methods to train our brain to improve not only our attention span, but other what we call executive function. These are capacities in the brain that help us in real life situations, like solving problems, being able to think flexibly, change things that we've learned previously and learn new things. And all of these things can improve with evidence is showing meditation practices as an example. So, just being able to practice for 20 minutes at a time to be in a quiet space with no distractions, close your eyes and focus on one thing, which could be a phrase, a relaxing phrase, sensations in your body. Practicing that regularly can train your mind to be able to sustain focus on one thing at a time. And for children, meditation can be more active. For example, doing repetitive activities or exercises. In fact, it does the same thing as quiet meditation. It helps us be able to focus better.
Right. Dr. Ghazala, from your standpoint, what happens when the mind is relaxed and is in the motion of meditation, as Dr. Finza Latif just described for us?
So they have actually done a lot of studies, and I mentioned briefly before, we call what functional MRI scan, and they have also looked at the brain wave and everything, and there's some what we call evoke potentials. When we are relaxed and we're in good mood, basically what you're going to see, there are we have seen a neurotransmitter. Usually we're talking about the patient will see the good, which will make you feeling better. And most of the areas like our hippocampus and those will show that they are charging and in the relaxation. And then it might even connect to other areas like our hearing, our vision and memory, those areas. And it just basically relaxes and produces good neurotransmitter. Right.
Now, Dr. Hayat, now moving away from this, how we can concentrate on text more, let's talk about when we hear the fact that, the mind opens up by reading, by taking in different perspectives. How does that cultivate different types of skills, especially when we're talking about creativity and imagination?
So how it works is actually the studies have shown what will happen is anytime we do a new activity, it makes what we call new connections. And those connections, the more you repeat it, stays with you. And I just always give this example. If you're a child and you learn how to ride a bike, You will make new connection. You will have what we call, it's like that area of function and will remain there. I mean, 20 years later, you pick up a bike, you might be a little bit scared, but then you can still able to go and once we do reading, it will make more connection. When they make more connection, it gives you more creativity. An ordinary person, example, like, our poets or our artists, the poets will say the eyes look like an ocean. An ordinary person will never think that way. I mean, we have eventually learned because of the literature, but what happens is that when we read more, all these areas, you start making new connection. And they have done study on this. So let's say a patient is literary and reads a lot, does a lot of artwork, everything. They'll make these connections. And when saw the eyes, or she saw the eyes, it connected to that creativity of that maybe ocean, So these new connection, what we call synapses, that's how we start thinking about newer and depth, and that increases your, creativity and new ideas, adaptability, and being more empathetic.
Right. Dr. Finza Latif, retaining this information, as Dr. Ghazala Hayat talked to us about this creation of new connections, is there a way to maximize the potential of us being able to actually retain that information, keep it longer with us, so that it does help us cultivate those feelings of empathy? It does help us see those various perspectives, make different connections in the world when we see things happening in real time.
Yeah, so we know that what helps form memories and makes them stronger is repetition. So if you reread the same thing, you're much more likely to remember it. Second, the emotional impact that's associated with something that, if you read something that really excites you, you're much more likely to remember it. And also, again, limiting like how much information you're giving to your brain at one time can help you, which is the same as focus. So if you focus on something, you will be more likely to remember it.
Right. Dr. Finza Latif, now I'm curious to ask you this because this just is right up in your alley. We've been talking about different types of literature. I want to focus on self-help books. We've been seeing an influx of them. We've been seeing more and more titles come out with more and more doctors giving their opinions. What is your take on them? Do they really help to the extent that they claim to?
This is very, I can't make a general statement about that. There are certain areas where a self-help book can help. So, if you're learning how to be more organized, and if you get certain concrete techniques to help you with organization, certainly if you have the capacity to do that, you will be able to learn it.
Right.
It becomes difficult when you may not have the capacity. For example, a child who is very inattentive. If you teach, you have to help them in different ways. You can't expect a child or an adult to just read a book and then be able to change their behavior. Similarly, there are lots of self-help books out there for depression, and again, if it depends on the severity of what you're going through.
Right. Thank you so much for answering that very abrupt or all of a sudden a question that was sprung on you. But I do think that would be helpful for many people who are seeking advice, especially in the form of books. Thank you so much, Dr. Finza Latif, for joining us from Qatar, Dr. Ghazala Hayat for joining us from Virginia. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.